You've been falling for one of the biggest scams in Best Buy, and you probably don't even realize it. It doesn't feel like a scam when it happens. It feels like you're being smart, responsible, protected. But according to ex-employees, this is exactly how customers quietly lose hundreds of dollars without ever noticing. And in this video, we're going to expose what that everyday scam really is and why employees warn people about it. Stay until the end, because chances are you've fallen for it too. And once you see it, you'll make very different decisions next time. Why Best Buy feels safe. Walk into Best Buy and everything feels trustworthy. It looks professional. It feels safe. And that's exactly why so many people fall for the store's most profitable scam, the extended protection plan. That feeling isn't accidental. Best Buy has spent years building a reputation around expertise and trust. Employees wear uniforms that signal authority. They use confident, reassuring language. They don't rush you, and they don't hover. Compared to buying electronics online or from a random retailer, this feels safer, more responsible, more controlled. Former employees say this sense of safety is one of the most powerful tools the store has. Customers walk in already believing they're making a better choice by being there. You're not guessing based on reviews. You're not worrying about scams or knockoffs. You're talking to a real person in a real store who seems to know what they're doing. That trust changes how you think. Once you believe you're in a safe environment, your guard drops. You stop approaching decisions like risks that need to be questioned and start treating them like steps in a sensible process. The mindset shifts from "what am I being sold" to "what's the right way to do this?" Employees understand this shift well because they see it happen every day. Customers who would normally hesitate about spending money feel calmer here. They're more open to suggestions. They're more receptive to guidance, not because anyone pressured them, but because the environment itself has already done the work. What makes this especially effective is that nothing about it feels manipulative. There's no obvious moment where you think, "I'm being sold something I don't need." The store doesn't rely on urgency or fear in an obvious way. Instead, it relies on familiarity and reassurance. You're led to believe that whatever decision you make here is automatically safer than making it anywhere else. And once that belief settles in, the rest becomes much easier. When a recommendation comes up later, it doesn't feel like a pitch. It feels like a continuation of that same safe, responsible process you already trust. At that point, you're not questioning motives anymore. You're just trying to make the best choice. That feeling of safety is the doorway. Everything that follows depends on it. The invisible sales game happening around you. While you're walking through the store comparing screens, specs, and prices, there's another process happening at the same time that most customers never notice. It's quiet, it's internal, and you're not meant to see it. Former Best Buy employees explain that every interaction on the sales floor exists on two levels. On the surface, it feels like normal help, someone answering questions, making suggestions, and guiding you toward the right product. But underneath that conversation, there's a completely different system operating, one that has nothing to do with how confident or satisfied you feel as a customer. Behind the scenes, employees are being tracked constantly, not just on whether you buy something, but on what else gets attached to that purchase. Certain services, add-ons, and protections are monitored closely. Managers don't just look at sales totals, they look at patterns. How often a customer leaves with more than they originally planned to buy? How consistently specific? Recommended options are mentioned. How well employees guide conversations toward those outcomes. The key thing customers never realize is that this tracking doesn't show up as pressure. Employees aren't supposed to sound pushy or aggressive. In fact, former workers say that overt selling is discouraged because it makes customers uncomfortable. The system works best when it feels like advice rather than a pitch. That's why the conversation often feels so natural. A recommendation is slipped into the discussion while you're already engaged. It's framed as something most people do, something sensible, something that just makes sense given the purchase you're making. There's no dramatic moment where alarms go off in your head, because nothing about the interaction feels unusual. One former employee described it as wearing two masks at the same time. To the customer, you're a helpful expert, trying to make sure they don't run into problems later. To management, you're a set of numbers on a dashboard, measured by how effectively you move customers towards certain decisions. And those numbers matter more than most shoppers would ever guess. They affect schedules, performance reviews, and whether an employee gets praised or pulled aside for additional coaching. So when certain recommendations come up again and again, it's not because every customer magically needs the same thing. It's because the system quietly rewards those conversations. From your perspective, you still feel in control. You're asking the questions. You're making the final decision. Nothing feels forced. That sense of autonomy is intentional, because once you believe you're choosing freely, you stop scrutinizing the suggestion as closely. At this stage, nothing feels wrong. You haven't spent extra money yet in a way that hurts. You haven't experienced regret. Everything still feels reasonable, even helpful. And that's what makes this setup so effective. Because once the conversation has been guided this way, the next step doesn't feel like an upsell at all. It feels like the logical thing to do, the kind of decision a careful person would make without hesitation. And that's where the real shift happens. The real product isn't what you think. By the time you reach this point in the store experience, most customers believe they're there to buy technology. A laptop, a TV, a phone, something tangible that you can touch, compare, and walk out with. That's the obvious transaction, and it's the one people focus on the most. But former Best Buy employees say that's not where the real business is. Behind the scenes, electronics themselves are often treated as the starting point, not the goal. Many of the big-ticket items people come in for carry surprisingly thin margins. Televisions, laptops, gaming consoles. They draw people into the store, but they're not always where the store makes its easiest money. That part comes later, layered quietly on top of the purchase. What customers don't see is that certain add-ons and services are far more valuable to the store than the device itself. These extras don't look dramatic. They don't feel like luxury upgrades. They're framed as sensible additions that simply complete the purchase, making sure you're covered or set up properly. Former employees explain that this is why certain recommendations appear in almost every conversation, regardless of what you're buying. Whether it's a laptop, a TV, or a tablet, the discussion eventually drifts toward the same categories of add-ons. To the customer, it feels personalized. To the system, it's predictable. The reason this works so well is because the add-ons don't feel optional in the way accessories do. You can easily say no to an extra case or a different cable. But when something is positioned as protection, preparation, or prevention, it stops feeling like an upsell and starts feeling like part of the responsible purchase itself. Customers often walk away believing they simply finished the transaction properly. They didn't buy more, they did it the right way. That framing matters, because once a purchase feels complete, people stop revisiting the decision in their minds. There's no lingering doubt, no sense that they need to double-check anything later. Former employees say this is where the misunderstanding really begins. Customers think the product they bought is the laptop or the TV, but internally, the store sees the transaction differently. The hardware is just the entry point. The real value comes from what gets attached to it. And once you understand that shift, that the focus isn't the device but the system built around it, the rest of the experience starts to look very different. Because the next step isn't about selling you something flashy. It's about guiding you towards something that feels so reasonable. You barely notice yourself agreeing to it. And that's where things start to get interesting. How fear is quietly introduced. Once the focus shifts away from the device itself, the conversation subtly changes. It's no longer just about features or performance. It starts drifting toward what could go wrong. Not in an alarming or dramatic way, but in a calm, reasonable tone that feels almost helpful. Former employees explain that fear is never introduced as fear. No one says, "This is likely to break," or "You're making a risky purchase." Instead, the language is soft and reassuring. Phrases like "just in case," "for peace of mind," or "most people choose this" are woven naturally into the discussion. The goal isn't to scare you. It's to make uncertainty feel normal. This is where the timing matters. The suggestion doesn't come when you're undecided or skeptical. It comes after you've already committed emotionally to the purchase. You've chosen the model. You've imagined using it. You've mentally spent the money. At that point, the idea of something going wrong feels more personal. Because it threatens something you already see as yours. Former employees say this is one of the most effective parts of the system. Customers don't feel anxious, they feel prudent. They're not reacting to danger, they're preparing for it. And preparation feels responsible, especially when you're spending a significant amount of money. One ex-employee recalled how customers often nodded along during this part of the conversation without asking many questions. Not because they didn't care, but because everything sounded reasonable. The possibility of future problems was presented as a fact of life, not a risk calculation. Technology fails, accidents happen. Being prepared just makes sense. What makes this especially powerful is that the fear is never tied to a specific outcome. There's no clear image of what might go wrong, which means there's nothing concrete to argue against. You can't easily say, that won't happen, because it's framed as a general truth rather than a prediction. By the time this part of the conversation ends, many customers feel like they've reached a fork in the road. One path feels careful and complete, the other feels like cutting a corner, and once a decision is framed that way, most people don't want to be the person who chose the shortcut. At this stage, the scam still doesn't feel like a scam. It feels like common sense. You're not being rushed. You're not being pressured. You're simply being guided toward what feels like the safer option. Once fear has been introduced this quietly, the next step doesn't feel like a leap at all. It feels like the natural conclusion to a decision you already believe is smart. Why smart? Careful people fall the hardest. One of the most uncomfortable truths former Best Buy employees point out is that this scam doesn't target reckless shoppers. It doesn't rely on impulse buying, confusion, or lack of knowledge. In fact, it works best on people who believe they're doing everything right. The customers who fall for it most consistently are planners. They research before coming in. They compare models. They ask thoughtful questions. They're trying to avoid regret, avoid waste, and avoid making a mistake they'll have to fix later. From the outside, they look like the ideal, responsible shopper. That's exactly why this works on them. When you see yourself as careful and financially aware, you're more likely to accept something framed as protection. It aligns with your identity. You're not someone who cuts corners. You're not someone who takes unnecessary risks. So, when a recommendation is positioned as the responsible option, it doesn't feel like a sales pitch. It feels like confirmation of who you already believe you are. Former employees say they noticed this pattern constantly. Customers who hesitated over specs or pricing often became decisive the moment the conversation shifted to prevention. The logic felt simple. If you're already spending this much, why wouldn't you protect it? That thought shuts down skepticism almost instantly. What makes this even more effective is that declining the offer can feel slightly uncomfortable. Saying no doesn't feel like saving money. It feels like admitting you're willing to gamble. And most people don't like seeing themselves that way, especially when the difference in cost is framed as relatively small compared to the original purchase. This is where the scam becomes almost invisible. You're not being tricked into something you don't understand. You understand it, at least on the surface. The problem is that the framing skips the part where you stop and ask whether the protection actually benefits you, or whether it mostly benefits the system offering it. Former employees say, this is why regret doesn't show up immediately. People walk out feeling satisfied, even proud of their decision. They believe they handled the purchase like an adult. The realization that something was off doesn't come until much later, if it comes at all, and when it does, it's rarely framed as being scammed. People blame bad luck, timing, circumstances. They don't revisit the original decision because it still feels reasonable in their memory. That's the trap. The scam doesn't rely on confusion. It relies on confidence. And once you understand that, you start to see why the smartest, most careful shoppers are often the ones who lose the most. Because when intelligence is used as the bait, you never feel like you're being led anywhere at all. That sets the stage for what employees see after customers walk away, when the conversation changes and the system reveals what it really values. What employees say after you leave. The moment you walk out of the store, the entire tone of the interaction changes in a way most customers never see. From your perspective, the transaction is over. You bought what you came for. You made what felt like a responsible decision, and you leave believing everything went exactly as it should. Behind the Scenes, that's not how the sale is remembered. Former Best Buy employees say that once a customer leaves, the conversation shifts away from helping and toward evaluation. The question isn't whether the customer felt confident or whether the product truly fit their needs. The question becomes whether the transaction met internal expectations. What was purchased is noted, but what really matters is what was added. Sales are broken down into components. Hardware is just one part of the equation. Services, protections, and add-ons are tracked separately and weighed heavily. A transaction where a customer walks out with only the device is rarely celebrated. A transaction where extras are attached is. Ex-employees describe how managers review these numbers constantly, not in dramatic meetings or confrontations, but in quiet check-ins, performance dashboards, and subtle feedback. Employees quickly learn what the system values and what it doesn't. Over time, that understanding shapes how conversations on the sales floor unfold. This is where the disconnect becomes uncomfortable. Many employees are fully aware that customers leave feeling relieved, even proud of their decision. They also know that the same customers may come back later with questions, frustration, or regret. But because that regret doesn't surface immediately, it never gets connected back to the original moment. Several former employees admitted this created an internal conflict. They would warn their own friends and family to be careful, to think twice, to avoid certain decisions. But when it came to regular customers, they were expected to follow the system, not because they were dishonest people, but because the system rewarded compliance and penalized hesitation. If this is already changing how you see in-store sales, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It helps more people see this before they make the same mistake. Over time, this process becomes normalized. Employees stop thinking about individual outcomes and start thinking in terms of metrics. A sale is successful if it looks good on paper, regardless of how it plays out later for the person who made it. The numbers are what remain visible. The consequences fade into the background. And when customers do return, confused about a charge, disappointed with how something worked, or realizing they paid for something they didn't really need, the original decision is rarely revisited. The moment that mattered already passed quietly, without friction, without alarm. From the store's perspective, the transaction is complete. The sale has been logged. The targets have been met. But from the customer's perspective, the story is still unfolding. Because what employees see again and again is that the real cost of this decision doesn't show up right away. It surfaces later, spread out over time, in ways that don't feel dramatic enough to immediately trace back to the source. And that delay, that separation between the decision and the consequence, is what allows this system to keep working. Because by the time the damage becomes clear, most people never think to ask where it really began. The damage. You never connect back. What makes this scam so effective is that the damage doesn't arrive all at once. There's no single moment where everything breaks or a big charge suddenly hits your account and makes you feel alarmed. Instead, the cost shows up slowly, spread out over time, in ways that feel disconnected from the original decision. Former employees say this is why so many customers never label the experience as being ripped off. When something goes wrong months later, it feels like bad luck. When money feels tighter than expected, it gets blamed on normal expenses. When a replacement or repair costs more than anticipated, people assume that's just how technology works now. Rarely does anyone stop and trace those moments back to what they agreed to at checkout. That delay is crucial. Longer the gap between the decision and the consequence, the harder it is for your brain to link the two together. You don't feel the pain at the point of purchase, so there's no emotional marker telling you something went wrong. By the time you realize you've lost money, the original moment feels distant, reasonable, and already justified in your memory. Former employees explain that this is where the real financial damage happens. It's not just the upfront cost, but the way small, seemingly sensible decisions add up over years. A little extra here, a little more there, each one feels minor on its own. But together, they quietly drain hundreds, sometimes thousands, without ever triggering the feeling that you made a mistake. What makes this even more frustrating is that the loss often disguises itself as responsibility. You don't think, I wasted money. You think, I did what I was supposed to do. That belief protects the original decision from scrutiny and allows the same pattern to repeat the next time you make a purchase. Employees saw this cycle play out constantly. The same customers would return for new devices, carrying the same assumptions, making the same choices, and feeling the same confidence. The system didn't need to change tactics, because nothing ever felt obviously wrong to the person experiencing it. And this is where the story starts to come together. All of the trust, the framing, the fear, and the delayed consequences point back to a single mechanism that makes the whole thing possible. One system that looks harmless, even helpful, on the surface, but quietly reshapes the math in a way customers almost never notice. Because once you see how that mechanism works, the entire experience snaps into focus. And that's what we need to talk about next. The scam explained. Why the math was never in your favor. Everything in this experience leads back to one familiar offer that almost everyone has heard and almost no one questions. Extended protection plans, especially the kind sold at checkout as a form of safety. This is the scam. Not because protection itself is illegal or imaginary, but because it is sold in a way that quietly reshapes risk, timing, and math. So the outcome overwhelmingly favors the store, while making customers feel responsible for agreeing. The first part of how this works is the way risk is framed. When protection is offered, it creates the impression that failure is not just possible, but likely. Devices are described as fragile. Accidents are implied to be common. The idea planted in your mind is that something going wrong is only a matter of time. What's left out of that framing is how electronics actually behave in the real world. Most devices that are going to fail do so early, during the manufacturer's warranty period that already comes free with your purchase. If a device makes it past that window, the odds of it continuing to work for years increase significantly. The protection plan feels like insurance against danger, but the danger itself has been quietly overstated. The second part of the scam is timing. The protection offer doesn't come when you're still deciding whether to buy the product. It comes after you've already chosen it, accepted the price, and emotionally committed to owning it. At that point, the device already feels like it's yours. The thought of something happening to it feels personal, not theoretical. That's when, just in case, logic becomes powerful. You're no longer evaluating the purchase objectively. You're defending something you already believe belongs to you. The offer isn't designed to help you think, it's designed to catch you at the exact moment you're most likely to say yes. Then there's the math, which is where most people lose without ever realizing it. Protection plans are priced to feel small relative to the cost of the device. An extra $100 or $2 doesn't seem like much when you're already spending $1,000. But that framing hides the real calculation. Over multiple purchases, across several years, customers quietly spend hundreds or even thousands on protection plans that never get used. Most plans expire unused, which means the store keeps the full amount with no service ever rendered. Even when a claim is made, the replacement is based on current market value, not what you originally paid. The plan technically fulfills its promise, but the financial outcome still favors the seller. The final part of the scam is what makes it so hard to detect: the lack of immediate pain. There's no obvious moment where you feel cheated. Nothing breaks right away. No bill arrives that shocks you. In many cases, nothing happens at all. And because nothing goes wrong, you never revisit the decision. The money is already spent, the plan quietly expires, and the experience gets filed away in your mind as a responsible choice. That absence of friction is not accidental. It's the reason the system works. You don't feel scammed. Because there's no dramatic failure to point to, only a quiet transfer of money in exchange for reassurance. Put all of this together, and the picture becomes clear. You weren't paying for protection based on realistic risk. You were paying for peace of mind, shaped by fear, offered at the most vulnerable moment, priced to feel insignificant, and structured so that most people would never benefit from it. The system doesn't need you to lose loudly. It only needs you to lose quietly. That's why this is the scam so many people fall for, not because they're careless or uninformed, but because every part of the process is designed to make agreeing feel like the smartest thing you could do. And once you see how all the pieces fit together, it becomes impossible to look at that offer the same way again. If this video changed how you think about in-store purchases, hit the like button so more people see this before making the same mistake. And if you want more insider breakdowns that expose everyday money traps hiding in plain sight, make sure you're subscribed. Now, tell me in the comments, what's the one purchase you regret the most after realizing you didn't really need the extra protection at all?